Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
All right, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder. We got a jam-packed show for you today. So we're going to be covering a lot of different things today. The first segment, we'll be talking about the top 10 PPR players for fantasy in 2021. In the second segment, we're going to do the top 10 biggest disappointments of 2020. Then we're going to do the top 10 defenses that you're going to want to get for 2021. A lot of these defenses may be coming off of bad seasons, and I think that they'll have some rebounds in 2021. And, defenses that, have been consistent in fantasy that you're going to want to get. And then for the last segment, we're going to do another edition of Draft or Pass, and this will be the wide receiver edition. So with that, let's get right into the first segment. So first segment, like I just said, will be the top 10 PPR players for 2021. So, it's kind of tough to rank these players, so we're kind of going to go in a random order. But, once we get more towards the end, then those will kind of be the better players on this list. So, to start off this list, we got the wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins, who will be entering his 8th season in the NFL, was drafted in the first round of the 2013 NFL draft by the Houston Texans. And of course, yes, like I have keep mentioning since I've been doing this show, is that horrible trade that the Texans made by trading DeAndre Hopkins to Arizona for David Johnson. And yeah, that'll go down as one of the worst trades of all time. So DeAndre Hopkins is number 10 on this list. I have him a little bit lower just because I think there's better players on this list. But he does deserve some consideration here. I mean, last year, 160 targets in 16 games with the Cardinals. He did have a productive season, though, you expect the numbers to be a little bit better. But in terms of PPR, he had 287 points, which is, not the highest that he has had in his career. He's definitely had more targets per season in different seasons when you look at it. And it's kind of remarkable considering that, throughout his career he's played with a bunch of different QBs that, some of them aren't even in the league anymore. But, it's pretty remarkable what he's been able to do over the course of his career. Listen, again, this guy is a high-volume guy. He's going to get targets, and I think, like I've talked about on previous shows, I think the Cardinals, are going to be even better next year. Especially offensively. I think Kyler Murray is going to have a really good season. He should have a really good season. Hopefully he's better protected. And I think that the relationship between him and DeAndre Hopkins is going to be better. And, when you look at some of DeAndre Hopkins' games from 2020, week 1 against the 49ers, he caught 14 balls on 16 targets, 29 points there. Had 23 points against the Detroit Lions, had 25 points against the Jets, had 24 points against Seattle, which was that Sunday Night Football marathon. That was an incredible game. 25 points against the Bills. Against the Bills he had that Hail Mary catch that definitely helped. Had 22 points against the Giants. So he he was really good when it came to PPR, and I think expect him to have an even better season than he did in 2020. So DeAndre Hopkins is the first player on this list. All right, so the next player on this list, we have the running back for the New York Giants, Saquon Barkley, who will be entering his 4th season in the NFL. Time really flies. He was the 2nd overall pick in the 2018 NFL Draft by the New York Giants out of Penn State. Now, obviously, he only played 2 games in 2020 because of the torn ACL that he suffered against the Bears in Week 2. Only had 34 yards rushing. Receiving, only had 6 receptions on 9 targets. Really didn't do anything in those 2 games. Especially in Week 1 against the Steelers when, every time he got the ball, he was, tackled in the backfield and did absolutely nothing. So, when you look at Saquon, especially when you look at 2018, okay, when Eli Manning was the quarterback, in the receiving game, he had 121 targets for 91 receptions. On 91 receptions. Had 721 yards receiving. And then in 2019, it kind of dipped a little bit. 73 targets, 52 receptions. Because let's be honest, 2018, Eli was not what he was, throughout his career. And, the Giants struggled that season. And Eli was always just checking down to Saquon, and that's why, the targets are so high. But I think that Saquon's going to be, a factor in the passing game as well. I think he is an underrated receiving back. I kind of do worry about how he's going to be, just specifically running. Because I don't know if the Giants' offensive line is going to be able to run block for him. Now, they did a better job as the season went on. But, I think in terms of the receiving game, I think Saquon's going to get a lot of targets. So, I expect him to, be productive in that regard. Now, when you look at his points in 2018, PPR-wise, 385 he had in 2018. And like I said, that's because of, Eli constantly checking down to him. So I don't expect that to happen, but I do expect him to be a factor in the passing game. The Giants have a lot of weapons, and you know what? The offense is going to run through him, hopefully. So I think that he's going to be an effective PPR player in 2021. All right, so the next player on this list is the running back for the Los Angeles Chargers, Austin Eckler, who will be entering his 5th season in the NFL. And, didn't have a productive season due to injury, but listen, I think he's going to have a bounce back season. Entered the league in 2017, like I just said. But in 2019, that was when he really broke out. In terms of receiving, had 993 yards, was targeted 108 times, and got 92 receptions. And you look at his other years, 2017 only had 35 targets in the receiving game, had 53 targets in the receiving game in 2018. But 2019 is really by far his best season in the NFL. And he only started 8 games in 2019. He played in all 16, only started in 8 because they had, of course, Melvin Gordon. But now Melvin Gordon is no longer there. So, he was supposed to take on an even bigger role, but it really didn't work out because he only played in 10 games due to injury. And only had 65 targets and 54 receptions. So, and also the Chargers did make a QB change between Justin Herbert and Phillip Rivers. Well, they went from Phillip Rivers to Justin Herbert. So maybe that might have something to do with it. I expect Eckler to have a bounce-back season as well. I think he is going to be one of the best people when it comes to PPR. I mean, if you look at the fantasy points in terms of PPR, had 106 in 2017, 168 in 2018, 309 in 2019, and then went back down to 165 in 2020. I think he's going to go back up. I think the numbers will be back up. I really do. I think he should have a productive season. And then you look in the games that he did play in, his best game came against the Carolina Panthers when he had 31 points in week 3, had 11 receptions on 11 targets, so he caught everything. So I think he's going to be another one of those guys that when it comes to PPR, you're going to want to have him on your team. All right, so the next player on this list, I have the running back for the Minnesota Vikings, Dalvin Cook, who will be entering his 5th season in the NFL, was a second-round pick in 2017 by the Vikings. Now, listen, he's more effective on the ground, obviously, but, when you look at his numbers in the receiving game, his best season when it came to receiving yards was 2019, had 519, had 63 targets had 53 receptions out of those 63 targets. In 2020, he had 361 receiving yards on 54 targets with 44 receptions from that. And he is actually coming off his best season when it comes to PPR with 337 total points. And you look at some of the best games that he had. The best game by far that he had was back in Week 8 when he had 48 points against the Packers, had 3 targets, 2 receptions, 63 yards, and 1 touchdown. And he just absolutely destroyed Green Bay in that game. And you look at some of the other games that he had that were really good. He had, the game against the Titans in Week 3 where he had 25 points there. Had 28 points against the Texans in Week 4, so he was really good. And then Week 9 against the Lions, he had 39 points there. So he's really good in PPR as well. Now I think Austin Eckler is a better receiving back than Dalvin Cook is, but Dalvin Cook is the more effective running back. And he's going to put up better numbers than Austin Eckler. But in terms of PPR, he's going to get the points on the ground. He's not going to get the points in the passing game. He will get his share of points in the passing game, but he's more of that ground and pound type running back. But I have him higher on this list just because he's the more effective running back. So Dalvin Cook, next player on this list. So the next player on this list, I have the wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs, Tyreek Hill. He'll be entering his 6th season in the NFL. Was a 5th-round pick in the 2016 NFL Draft for the Chiefs. He was wide receiver 2 in 2020, was second in touchdowns, and he had 1,200 receiving yards, just over that. In 15 games for the Chiefs in 2020, was targeted 135 times, had 87 receptions in 15 games. He averaged 9.5 yards per target, 14.7 yards per reception. And in terms of PPR numbers, he had 328.9, which is 0.9 better than what he had in 2018. So basically he replicated what he did back in 2018. In terms of fantasy points per game, however, it was his career high. He had 21.9 there, had 20.5 in 2018. Again, this is another high volume guy. The one thing that you have to be concerned about with Tyreek Hill is his health. But, again, had a productive season, had 15 touchdowns in 2020, which was his career best. So, he's going to be really good again this season if he's healthy. And, looking at some of his best games, by far, let's be honest, the best game that he did have was back in Week 12 when he had 57.9 points against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And he had, 200 yards in the first quarter. So, that was unreal, that game. But, of course, he did nothing in the Super Bowl. But, yeah, that was his best game. Other games, 33 points against the Panthers, 25 against the Jets, 26 against the Dolphins. he's going to get, if he's healthy, he's going to be great. He's one of the top wide receivers in the game. He's going to get a lot of targets, and he's on the best offense in the NFL, arguably. So, he's going to have another good season. So Tyreek Hill, another player on this list. All right, so the next player on this list, we have Stefon Diggs, the wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills. He will be entering his 7th season in the NFL, was a 5th-round pick back in the 2015 NFL draft by the Minnesota Vikings. Had a very good season with the Bills. This was his first season with the Bills. He was wide receiver 3, and he had 8 touchdowns in 2020. I mean, this was by far his best season as a pro. In 2020, he had 166 in terms of targets on 127 receptions, 1,535 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns like I just mentioned, averaged 9.2 yards per target, averaged 12.1 yards per reception, and by far in terms of fantasy, he averaged 20.5 fantasy points per game in terms of PPR and had 328 fantasy points, which was his career high. And some of the best games that he had, Week 2 against the Dolphins, 29 points. In Week 10 against Arizona, had 25. Week 14 against Pittsburgh, 29. Week 15 against Denver, 25 points. Week 16, I can't talk today. Week 16 against the Patriots, he had 41 points, which was his best game of the season. So, again, high-volume guy. Josh Allen is going to be looking for him constantly, and, you definitely saw that considering, 166 in terms of targets. I mean, that's just insane. So, expect another productive season from Stefon Diggs. And you know what? You might see him possibly be taken in the first round in some drafts. I think, again, there's still better receivers there, but, maybe this is where he kind of cracks through and is a first-round pick. So Stefon Diggs, another player on this list. All right, so next player on this list, we have Alvin Kamara, the running back for the New Orleans Saints. He'll be entering his 5th season in the NFL, was a 3rd-round pick back in the 2017 NFL draft. In terms of fantasy points, he was number 1 at the running back spot. Had 21 total touchdowns, which was 1st in the NFL. Had 937 rushing yards. Now, looking at his stats in PPR, actually had his best season in terms of PPR numbers. Had with 377, averaged 25.2 points per game. In the receiving game, 756 yards, 5 touchdowns. Had 107 targets, which was a career high. In 15 games with the Saints. Again, had another productive season. And listen, if like I've been talking about the last couple of shows, if the quarterback position is consistent with the Saints, expect Kamara to have good numbers there. Some of his best games, had 44 points against the Packers in Week 3. In Week 2 against the Raiders, he had 38. In Week 10 against the Niners, he had 34. In Week 14, he had 22 against the Eagles. But by far his best game came against the Minnesota Vikings when he had 6 total touchdowns, had 155 rushing yards, averaged 7 yards per rush, had 56 total points in that game. I mean, that was his best game, and that was one of the top performances in fantasy in 2020. Now, I don't expect him to do that again, 56 points. I mean, you never know. I'm concerned about the Saints quarterback spot, which I've talked about on previous shows. But you know what? Kamara's going to get a lot of targets. He's the lead back in New Orleans, and expect him to have another productive season, no matter who the QB is for the Saints. So the next player on this list, I have the tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs, and that is Travis Kelce, who will be entering his 9th season in the NFL, was a 3rd-round pick back in the 2013 NFL draft, was the number 1 tight end in fantasy. I mean, it's pretty obvious. When you look at his numbers, I mean, 2020 was his best season. had 312 points, averaged 21 points a game pretty much, had 145 targets, caught 105 balls, which was the most of his career in terms of receptions, career high. Had 1,400 yards, 11 touchdowns. Again, that's a career high, 11 touchdowns in a single season for him. Averaged 13.5 yards per reception. I mean, he was great. He another guy that's great. Very high volume guy again. So consistent. I mean, when you look at week 8 on, I mean, 24 points, 25 points, 26, 16, 27, 27, 22, 22. I mean, so consistent. I mean, really the only games that he had that weren't that impressive was week 7 against the Broncos. He only had 6. Only had 10 against the Patriots back in week 4. Other than that, was really consistent. And listen, do I expect him to have the same exact numbers from 2020? No, but he's going to have another productive season. And he's Patrick Mahomes' security blanket, so expect him to continue to be productive for you if you get him in fantasy. And he could be a first-round pick. All right, and the next player on this list, of course, is Davante Adams, the wide receiver from the Green Bay Packers. Again, another guy that's going to be fantastic for you if you draft him. He was targeted 148 times and caught 115 of those targets, had 1,300 receiving yards, 18 touchdowns, which was a career high, averaged 11.9 yards per reception, had 358 fantasy points, which was a career high for him, averaged 25 fantasy points per game in terms of PPR, and some of his best games, week 1 against the Vikings, 41 points, week 7 against the Houston Texans had 44, had 30 against the Vikings the week after that, had 33 against the Niners after that week, had 34 against the Eagles in week 13, and had 43 points against the Titans in week 16. So, like I always say for pretty much every player, as long as he stays healthy, expect another productive season out of him. So Davante Adams was the next player on this list. And number 1 on this list, expect a huge bounce-back season for him, and that is the running back for the Carolina Panthers, Christian McCaffrey. Will be entering his 5th season in the NFL, was a first-round pick in the 2017 NFL draft by the Carolina Panthers. Only played in 3 games, but listen. He was productive in all 3 of those games. Had 28 points against the Raiders in week 1. In week 2 had 24 points against the Bucks. And then week 9 had 37 points in week 9 against the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, when you look at his numbers from 2019, he had 471 fantasy points in terms of PPR on, let's see, how many targets did he have in the receiving game? 141 targets in the receiving game. Had 1,000 yards receiving back in 2019. Expect him to have a bounce-back season, and I think he's going to be motivated to have a bounce-back season. And you know what? He's going to probably be the first overall pick again in fantasy drafts, so expect that. So those were the top 10 players, top 10 PPR players for 2021. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the top 10 biggest disappointments of 2020. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. So for the next segment in the show, we're going to be talking about the top 10 biggest disappointments from 2020. So let's get right into it. So the first player on this list, I have the newly acquired quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts, Carson Wentz, was the second overall pick in the 2016 NFL Draft, will be entering his sixth season in the NFL, was QB 22 in 2020. And, yeah, he was pretty pathetic in 2020. Started in 11 games, played in 12. Numbers dropped from 2019, where he actually had a productive season. 275 fantasy points back in 2019, and now I'm going off of standard numbers. Had 27 touchdowns in 2019 to 7 interceptions, and of course, his MVP season in 2017, he had 33 touchdowns to 7 interceptions there. In 2020, however, he had under 3,000 yards for the first time in his career, had 16 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. Now, he did have some solid games, but, towards the end, before he got benched for Jalen Hurts, he was really bad. He was really bad. Green Bay, the Green Bay game in Week 13, that was when he got benched. After back-to-back weeks where he dropped 25+, in Week 8 against Dallas, he only had 8 points. In Week 10 against the Giants, he only had 8 points in that contest. So, yeah, he was pretty pathetic in those games. So, he did kind of deserve to get benched. I mean, he only barely had 5 points against Green Bay before they benched him. So, a lot of that had to do with, I think he did lose a lot of confidence, playing in Philly. And I think the Eagles fans really got on him, and that kind of messed them all up. And I think just the Eagles have been a very dysfunctional organization ever since they won the Super Bowl back in 2017. So, it was pretty disappointing, especially if you did draft Carson Wentz. But, for me, I traded for him because I was very desperate. I had some injuries that I had to deal with, and I had to make some sacrifices. And Carson Wentz, I took the chance on him to be my number 2 QB to Aaron Rodgers. And, in the beginning it did pan out, but towards the end it kind of, flamed out. So, but I did pick up Jalen Hurts, and Jalen Hurts actually did end up being productive in fantasy. So, it's like I had that going for me. So, yeah, but overall Carson Wentz was pretty pathetic back in 2020. So, the next player on this list, I have the running back for the Arizona Cardinals, who just recently signed with them. That is James Conner, who is now the former running back of the Pittsburgh Steelers, was a third-round pick by the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2017, will be entering his 5th season in the NFL, is 25 years old, was running back 23 in fantasy, and yeah, he was bad in 2020. He was really bad in 2020. 2019, actually, he did put up, less points than he did in 2020. He did play in 13 games, started 11 of them. Didn't have over 1,000 yards, had 721 rushing yards, only 6 touchdowns. 2018 was by far his best season. He had 12 rushing touchdowns there, and that was because Le'Veon Bell wanted more money, so he sat out the whole season. He had 225 points in 2018. James Conner did, and this is going off of standard numbers. And listen, he did have a couple good games. He did have 20 points in Week 3 against the Houston Texans, had 18 points in Week 2 against the Broncos, had 16 against the Browns in Week 6. But after that, just really did not do anything. I mean, from Week 9 on, had 2 points against Dallas, had 4.8 against the Bengals, had 9.9 against Jacksonville, missed a couple games. In Week 14 against the Bills, only had 1.8. He did have 12.6 against the Colts, but, it's really nothing. And then week 17, he only had 6.2 points against the Browns. So, yeah, he really was not that good. I mean, compared to what he was in 2018, he just, couldn't stay healthy, and along with that, the Steelers just couldn't run the football. So, combination of those things led to James Conner being a part of this list. So, next player on this list, we have the newly acquired wide receiver for the New York Giants, and that is Kenny Golladay. Will be entering his 5th season in the NFL, was a 2017 third-round draft pick by the Detroit Lions. Only had 2 touchdowns this past season. Had 11 touchdowns in 2019. This was his worst season. Kenny Golladay in 2020 only played in 5 games with injuries. He wasn't. I mean, he did average 16 yards per reception, 10.6 yards per target. He was good in the games that he did play in. He had double-digit points in each game that he played in. But, this was a guy that, a lot of people, I think, were high on going into the draft, considering that him and Matthew Stafford had a good connection. He's a big wide receiver. He's a guy that you're going to want to, rely upon when he's in the red zone. And, yeah, only played in 5 games. So hopefully, as a Giant fan, he doubles that, triples that, So, Kenny Golladay, the next player on this list. All right, and the next player on this list, we have the running back for the Cincinnati Bengals, Joe Mixon. Will be entering his 5th season in the NFL. Was a second-round draft pick back in the 2017 NFL Draft by the Bengals. Only played in 6 games in 2020. Had only 428 rushing yards on 119 attempts. Had 3 touchdowns. Had 78 fantasy points. That was his career low. And, really the game that he was amazing in was Week 4 against the Jaguars. Had 151 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, had 36 fantasy points there. And this is going off of standard numbers. I mean, when you look at his previous seasons, 2018 was his best season in terms of fantasy. He had 200 points there. Had 190 in 2019. In 2017, he had 111. This was a guy that was going to... Everybody kind of expected him to take the next step in fantasy and put up even better numbers. But, he was reduced to only 6 games due to injury throughout the season. And you know what? Listen, the Bengals, they're kind of a mess of a franchise right now, and you're hoping that, through the draft and, whatever else they decide to do before the season starts that, first of all, they got to get an offensive line. I think that is the main thing here. I mean, that's why Joe Burrow, got injured, was because the Bengals just did not get him an offensive line. And, if the Bengals can fix that offensive line, and Joe Mixon is healthy, Joe Mixon is going to be good this season. I think that, he's going to be the guy that the Bengals are going to rely upon to, be the focal point of the offense until, Joe Burrow hopefully comes back at some point during the season. Supposedly he's expecting to play Week 1, which, I hope he does. He was very impressive in his rookie year. And listen, Joe Mixon only played in 6 games this past season. I think he's another guy that's going to want to prove that 2020 was an anomaly, and he's going to try to come in and play a full season. So yeah, Joe Mixon, a guy that many people expected to be really good in 2020. He wasn't due to injury. Expect him to bounce back, but yeah, Joe Mixon, another player on this list that was a pretty big disappointment in 2020. So, next player on this list, a guy that actually I talked about on the previous segment, and that's Austin Eckler, the running back for Los Angeles Chargers. Only played in 10 games, had 111 fantasy points, which was the lowest since 2017. So Eckler's entering his 5th season in the NFL, was a 2017 player that the Chargers brought in at running back. Now, obviously, Melvin Gordon was the lead back, so Eckler was supposed to take on a larger role in 2020, but injuries kind of, affected that. Had 403 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, that's nowhere near the numbers that he had back in 2019 when he had barely under 1,000 yards receiving with 993 and had 8 touchdowns, 8 receiving touchdowns back in 2019. Had 217 fantasy points, and this is going off of standard numbers. Really the best game he had was in Week 3 against the Panthers. Had 20 points there in terms of standard numbers. In terms of PPR, the numbers were a lot better, as I talked about in the previous segment. But yeah, he was supposed to take on a larger role and really did not live up to the expectations, especially because of injuries. So, like Joe Mixon, hopefully he comes back and he has a good season. Hopefully he can develop a rapport with Justin Herbert, and Justin Herbert utilizes him like Phillip Rivers did when Phillip Rivers was the quarterback of the Chargers. So Austin Eckler, another big disappointment in 2020. All right, so the next player on this list is the tight end currently for the Philadelphia Eagles. Zach Ertz will be entering his 9th season in the NFL, was a second-round draft pick back in the 2013 NFL draft by the Eagles, and he was tight end 29 in 2020. Yeah, he was bad. He was bad in 2020. Played in 11 games, 335 receiving yards, 1 touchdown, and that was back in Week 1. Only had 41 points on the year, and that's in terms of standard numbers. Never reached double digits. Really did not produce at all as a tight end. I really expected him to have another great season, but injuries and just Philadelphia being a mess of a franchise, that all kind of, coupled together kind of led to Zach Ertz not having a good season. Because when you look at it, 2019 had 916 yards receiving, 6 touchdowns, had 127 points there. He was great there. And that actually wasn't his best season. His best season came in 2018 when he had 164 points there, had 156 targets, 8 touchdowns, had 1,100 receiving yards. I mean, he fell off a cliff, in 2020. And we don't really know what the reason is for that. Is it because of the contract situation, QB changes, like I said, Philadelphia just simply being a dysfunctional franchise. There was a lot of things that led to Zach Ertz not being the tight end that we expected him to be. Because I drafted him and he was terrible, and I had to look for other things. And I was struggling to find a tight end. I went from, Jared Cook and trying to think of who else. I can't really think off the top of my head, but I did finally get Robert Tonyan, and he was productive, and I was fine with that. But Ertz was a really big disappointment. I don't remember what round I took him in, but I really expected him to have another great season, and he did not. So, yeah, wherever he ends up, hopefully he rebounds and, is the tight end that we expect him to be. So Zach Ertz, another player on this list. So the next player on this list, he actually made the previous list for segment number 1, and that was Saquon Barkley. Was the 2018 second overall pick. Will be entering his 4th season in the NFL with the New York Giants. Yeah, it was a big disappointment. Saquon was one of the top players taken in your fantasy drafts as a whole. Only played in 2 games, tore his ACL in Week 2 against the Bears. Only had 9 points on the season. Was bad against the Steelers. Didn't do anything there. Only had 6 rushing yards on 15 attempts. He was bad. And a large part that had to do with, the Giants just not being able to block for him, and, yeah. So, listen, I hope he has a bounce-back season. I hope the Giants, they, shore up the offensive line, because the offensive line did show some promise later on in the season after Saquon was hurt, when Wayne Gallman, Alfred Morris, Devontae Freeman, and others were running the football. So, let's hope that Saquon is back at full strength. But, yeah, he was a big disappointment. And, it really has been kind of a disappointment, since he entered the league. I mean, we really expected him to be like this monster. Now, listen, he's productive. There's no question about it. He's not been like, he's been a failure, but, really hasn't, fully impressed me. He struggles running in between the tackles. Really only has one big running play in him per game, and that kind of boosts his stats a little bit. But when you simply just watch him play, he's insane. I mean, some of the moves that he makes. And again, you could say, well, that's because the Giants' inability to block. And that is a very fair point. But he really hasn't, taken that next step. And hopefully this is his breakout season. I mean, not to say that he hasn't been productive, but it's just, we got to see more from him. And hopefully, hopefully he has an Adrian Peterson type season. Back in 2012, Peterson comes off his torn ACL, and he has an MVP type season. Hopefully that's what happens with Saquon. Because, listen, Saquon has put up good numbers, but we want him to take an even bigger step. I mean, you look at 2018, 1,300 yards rushing. 2019 had barely over 1,000 yards, and that was in 13 games due to injury. 2018 he had 11 rushing touchdowns and 4 receiving touchdowns. Had 294 fantasy points in 2018 in terms of fantasy numbers, or standard numbers. He's been productive, but we want consistency. We want more consistency, and we want more big plays, not just one big play each game. So yeah, Saquon Barkley, another player on this list. So the next player on this list, I have Ezekiel Elliott, the running back for the Dallas Cowboys. And yeah, this was by far his worst season. And, I talk about it a lot, Dak Prescott getting injured, the offensive line banged up throughout the season. That definitely played a role in Zeke not, producing at the level that we expected because, after Dak got injured in Week 5 against the Giants, Zeke never reached 20 points. And he only reached double-digit points 3 times after Week 5. So, you could say it's because of the offensive line, because of Dak getting injured. And, listen, Zeke is a big running back, and he's, he gets hit a lot. And, maybe this is kind of the beginning of the end for Zeke. Maybe he's going to start declining. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of more on the side that he's going to have a rebound season, and he's going to bounce back, and he's going to have, a productive, I would say another 2 to 3 years, at him being a, Not like what he was his rookie season, but, being a productive fantasy option. But he was a big disappointment. I mean, because of, not being able to run the football, fumbling a lot, it was a big disappointment for Zeke in 2020. But I expect him to bounce back. I really do. I think the offensive line's going to be better. Dak's coming back. That helps, so expect Zeke to bounce back. But yeah, he was a big disappointment in 2020. So the next player on this list, I have the wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints, and that is Michael Thomas. He'll be entering his 6th season in the NFL, was a second-round draft pick back in the 2016 NFL draft by the Saints, and he was wide receiver 86 in 2020. Had no touchdowns, only had 438 receiving yards, and yeah, he was bad in 2020. Only played in 7 games, started 5 of them, and it had to do with injuries and the suspension that he had placed on him by the team. And yeah, coming off of a season in 2019 where he had his career high with 225 fantasy points in terms of standard leagues, he only had 43. Now, he did have a touchdown in the playoffs, but again, playoffs doesn't matter when it comes to fantasy, unless you're doing a playoff fantasy league, and his numbers were bad. I mean, he only had 10 points in 2 games, and that was it. Other than that, 5 points in 2 games, 2 in 1 in week 1 against the Buccaneers, and then he had 8 in week 14 against the Eagles. Yeah, he just wasn't productive. I expect him to bounce back, but a guy that was a first-round draft pick in many fantasy leagues. I mean, he did nothing. And let's see how he does with the new quarterback. So yeah, Michael Thomas, another big disappointment on this list. And then finally, a guy that made the last segment was Christian McCaffrey. Will be entering his 5th season in the NFL. Was a first-round draft pick back in the 2017 NFL draft by the Panthers. Only had 6 touchdowns, played in only 3 games, was dealing with a lot of injuries throughout the season. So listen, I expect him to bounce back. I think he's going to have an insane year in 2021. He should. But, a guy that was taken as the first overall pick in a lot of drafts, and he only played in 3 games, I mean, that's a big disappointment. But I expect him to bounce back. So, yeah, Christian McCaffrey, the last player on this list. And with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the top 10 defenses that you're going to want to take in fantasy for 2021. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for segment number 3. We are going to talk about the top 10 defenses that you're going to want to get going into 2021. Now, listen, there's going to be, you're not going to prioritize defenses a lot, but you know what? I think it's a good thing to kind of talk about some of the good defenses because maybe, you're going to want to take them in your draft. I mean, obviously, yes, like I said, you're going to prioritize other positions, but you know what? Let's talk about defenses anyways. So, I'm not really going to go in particular order. I'm kind of just looking at, all the defenses from 2020, and I'm kind of just going to go off of, what I think. So, first team, I'm going to say the Niners as one of those defenses you're going to want to get. Now, the Niners in 2020, they had a lot of injuries. Guys like Dee Ford, Nick Bosa, Solomon Thomas, Richard Sherman, all these guys got injured. And, the Niners really weren't the team that they were back in 2019. I expect them to be better. I expect them to replicate what they did back in 2019. They're going to get Bosa back. I don't think Dee Ford's coming back because, he has that, I think it's like a neck injury. So it's going to be tough for him to come back, So let's hope that, everything works out with him. You look at the Niners numbers. They had, I'm trying to see, I'm looking at the stats here. They did have 12 interceptions in 2020. They had 8 fumble recoveries for 18 total turnovers. They had 35 sacks. So that what they did put up some productive numbers. I mean, against the Rams, they were great. Because they apparently have the Rams number for some reason, but they weren't what they were back in 2019, and you kind of expect them to come back, especially with Bosa coming back. One of the things that I didn't like was the fact that they traded DeForest Buckner, but you know what? Expect them to be a top 10 defense again if everybody's healthy, and a defense you're going to want to get, because listen, when you're playing against Russell Wilson and his offensive line, and you're going to get your sacks, and when it comes to fantasy, you're definitely going to want to get defenses that, get to the quarterback. So 49ers are one defense that I have here. Looking at some other defenses here that maybe you're going to want to get. I guess you're looking at the top. The Indianapolis Colts is another defense that you're definitely going to want to get. That's the team that got DeForest Buckner. Now, they averaged, in terms of points allowed, 22 points, had 15 interceptions, 11 fumble recoveries for 26 turnovers, had 40 sacks, 81 QB hits. They're a defense that's really good. Their defense, the Colts have done a great job of rebuilding that defense, drafting Darius Leonard, bringing in DeForest Buckner. They got a good defense. And that's another defense that you're definitely going to want to look at going into the 2021 NFL season, especially because when you look at the quarterback positions for the other teams in the divisions, Deshaun Watson, we all know his situation. Odds are he's probably never starting for the Texans again. So you're probably going to get a combination of Ryan Finley and Tyrod Taylor. So the Colts are going to have to deal with that twice a year. Twice going into next year. The Texans are probably going to go in a different direction with quarterbacks, so it's probably just going to be a one-year thing. So, expect turnovers coming from there. The Titans, that's toss-up. The Colts can definitely get turnovers against Tannehill and shut down Derrick Henry. I don't expect Derrick Henry to fumble, but, they can definitely do some damage there. And then you look at Jacksonville. Listen, Trevor Lawrence is most likely going to be drafted by the Jaguars, and the Jaguars got to be able to protect him, because if he's going to have to deal with that defense, that's not going to be it's not going to be pretty, So when you really when you think about it, Gardner Minshew beat the Colts, so but yeah, so especially when it comes to the Texans, the Colts are going to get their fair share of sacks. But again, that's another team that, really revamped their defense, and their defense is going to be pretty good going into 2021. So, kind of going through other defenses here. The Washington football team. That's another team that really did a great job at rebuilding their defense. That front four with Chase Young and Montez Sweat. That defense is gonna feast again this year. They had 47 sacks. They had 23 total turnovers, 100 QB hits. QB hits don't really factor into fantasy. But yeah, that's another defense that, you're going to want to get. Because think about it. They're going to be playing in the division with Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts, and Daniel Jones. Now, I don't know how the Dallas's offensive line is going to be, but, in the two games against Dallas, Washington's defense feasted, especially in that Thanksgiving game when they won 43-16. So that, and along with the Eagles being a mess, of a franchise, they're probably going to feast on the Eagles as well. I worry about the Giants going up against that defensive front, even though the Giants have beaten Washington, I think 5 of the last 6 games that they've played them, or whatever it's been, or they've won the last 6. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head, but they haven't lost. Yeah, I think they've won. They beat them in the second half of 2018. They won both in 2019, and they both won both. Yeah, so they won. They've won their 5 of their last meetings when these two teams have played against each other. But yeah, this is another team that's going to get a lot of sacks, and you're typically going to want that. The thing that concerns me is when they go up against better QBs going into 2021, going up against better quarterbacks, but I think they're going to be they're going to have another productive season as long as everybody stays healthy. All right, so another defense that I think is going to be really productive is the New York Giants. Now, the New York Giants defense the last couple of years has been pretty dreadful, and yeah, they've been pretty pathetic, but this past season, listen, the turnovers, they only had, they had 22 total turnovers. They had 40 sacks. They did get after the quarterback, and I think that's something that a lot of people are going to have to take into consideration when they're drafting defenses. I think the Giants are going to be a top 10 defense. I really do. They brought back Leonard Williams. The secondary is going to be even better, and who knows what they're going to do in the draft. I think that, they're going to feast on the Eagles. They're going to feast on Washington as well. They're going to be a good team this year, the Giants. I really think they're going to be a good team, and I think defensively they're going to be a good team as well. And, again, you're going to want to have a team that get turnovers and, get to the quarterback, and the Giants are going to be another one of those defenses that I think are going to be able to do that because, when you have a secondary that, is going to lock teams down, in terms of their skill position players, because think about it, they added Adoree Jackson, Jabril Peppers is still there, Xavier McKinney hopefully is implemented into the scheme because he really only played, a couple games last year, due to injury. And, you have James Bradbury. If those guys lock guys down, the defense is going to be able to get to the quarterback and sack the quarterback. And that is exactly what the Giants, or at least what I believe the Giants are going to do in 2021. So, another defense that I would probably put on here is the Buffalo Bills. I think they were a little bit disappointing defensively last season, but you know what? I think they're still going to be a top 10 defense, this year. They had 26 total turnovers, 38 sacks, so, less than the Giants a little bit. But you know what? I think the Bills are going to be better defensively. I think they're going to address some of their weaknesses in the draft. And you know what? Listen, when you have a top 10 offense, on the other side with Josh Allen and Diggs and, them bringing in Emmanuel Sanders, they're going to be good. The defense should be good. They're going to get turnovers. They have Tre'Davious White is there. They should be able to get after the quarterback more. They do play in a division with the Jets and the Dolphins, and the Patriots really aren't what they were in years past. So, I expect the Bills' defense to kind of take advantage of some of the deficiencies that the other teams in their division may have. So I think the defense is going to be better for them, and because of that, the Bills, another team I have on this list. Now, again, not necessarily going to be better than some of these other defenses that I've talked about, like Washington and like the Colts, but that's just another team that I'm looking at and saying that's going to be another defense you might want to have on your team. So another team that I probably would consider drafting their defense is probably the Dolphins. The Dolphins had 28 turnovers, 41 sacks. They really did improve. Now, they cut Kyle Van Noy, and Kyle Van Noy is now on the Patriots again. So, that's one guy that, I was kind of curious as to why they did that, but, they were productive as well. They have two really good corners in Byron Jones, who they brought in from the Cowboys, and they have Xavier Howard, who they brought in. He had a highlight reel play with, that one-handed interception against the Chiefs when the Chiefs came to town in Miami. They got a good defense as well. Now, they got absolutely shredded in Week 17 against the Bills. But other than that, their defense was pretty productive, this past season. And like I keep saying, they are going to get after the quarterback, and, they got really good corners. They're another defense that you're going to want to consider. Another defense on here would be the Saints. I'm a little skeptical of them, but I still think, they should be all right defensively. I don't think they're going to be like they were in years past. It's definitely going to be a new Saints team. A lot of guys leaving due to them, being a zillion dollars over the cap. Well, about like $100 million over the cap, which is really unheard of, for me, and I think that's because of the times that we're living in because of the pandemic. But I really expect the Saints to still be productive in terms of fantasy. Now, are you going to would I draft them? Not necessarily. I think that might be another one of those like waiver wire picks that you might have to make, but I still think they're going to be a top 10 defense. Cam Jordan is still there. They should be good going into the 2021 season. Now, they did have Brady's number in the 2 games that they played in the regular season. So I think they should be fine, going into the 2021 NFL season. I mean, they also have, a lot of question marks at QB for the other teams. Matt Ryan, listen, I think he's still going to be productive in fantasy. I think this is where he kind of starts to decline a little bit. The Panthers, they got, stuff going on at their QB spot with Sam Darnold coming in. The Saints definitely could take advantage of that if Sam Darnold, continues to turn the ball over a lot. So the Saints could still be productive defensively, but, there's a lot of question marks with them. But like I said, I think they're still going to be productive. All right, the next team on this list, really not going in any particular order, like I said, is the Bucs. Okay, their defense is insane. They had 48 sacks, 25 total turnovers. They're only going to get better. They're only going to get better. They brought everybody back. Everybody's coming back. Levante David, Shaq Barrett, JPP, Sue, they're all coming back. So they're going to be productive. And when you look at the secondary with Winfield and Murphy Bunting and Whitehead, those guys, listen, they were inexperienced, during the season because they were young. They were trying to get used to everything, the speed of the game and all that. They got absolutely killed against the Chiefs, when it came to Tyreek Hill, but they shut them down in the Super Bowl. Now they're, going into their second season. They're coming off that Super Bowl victory. Are they gonna repeat that? I think so. Looking at their schedule, they have the Falcons on their schedule, they have the Panthers twice on their schedule, and they got the Saints. So they're going to get sacks in those games. They definitely are. Off the top of my head, I don't know what they're playing I think they're playing the NFC East, I want to say. So if they're playing the NFC East, they're going to feast on the Eagles. They're probably going to get some turnovers against the Giants. They're going to get some turnovers against Dallas. They're going to get turnovers against Washington as well. We might get to see Brady versus Ryan Fitzpatrick, which, that'll be a sight to see. But they're going to be really good again. They're going to be right up there again. They're going to be a top 3 defense this year. They were already good enough with that front seven, but now with the secondary getting their act together, especially in the second half of the season, they're going to be dangerous. And that's a defense that is a must draft. I think we're now in like the must draft territory. The Tampa Bay Bucs defense is a must draft. You're going to want to get this defense because you know what, they're going to get a lot of sacks. Now, you worry about them when it comes to the secondary, but like I said, I think their secondary, it may be their weakness, but it might be a strength going into 2021. All right, so the next team on this list, I would say, is the Rams. The Rams, they had 53 sacks, 22 total turnovers, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they got Aaron Donald on the defensive line. Aaron Donald has been insane over the course of his career, since entering the league back in 2014, I want to say. Again, had another productive season, 13.5 sacks. His career high was 20.5. Overall, he's had 85.5 sacks for his career. It was kind of interesting. We thought that they were going to lose Michael Brockers to the Ravens, but they were able to bring him back. But I believe they got rid of him. Now I just remembered that now as I'm talking about this. I think he's now he's a defensive tackle for the Lions. So he joins Jared Goff, and it's kind of interesting because he kind of took a shot at Jared Goff when they traded. They did the QB swap, for Stafford, and now he's back with Jared Goff on Detroit. So so they don't have Brockers anymore. But they got Aaron Donald. They brought back Leonard Floyd, who had a pretty good season with the Rams. They got Jalen Ramsey in the secondary. They're gonna get turnovers and they're gonna get sacks. As long as Aaron Donald stays healthy, because he was banged up during the playoffs. But I expect him to be a monster again. He's definitely he's a really good player. He's a really good player, and as long as he stays healthy, he's going to get sacks, and hopefully Jalen Ramsey gets you turnovers. The Rams are another must-draft defense. They're a top 10 defense. I think they're going to continue to be that. Now when you add Matthew Stafford, does that put them back in the Super Bowl discussion? We're going to find out. But yeah, the Rams are another must-draft defense. And then I guess the final defense I have here is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, they might take a step back this year because they did lose Bud Dupree in the offseason. But TJ Watt's a monster. Again, another great season for them. They led the league in sacks again, which they've done the last couple seasons with 56. They had 28 total turnovers, which I think that's the most in the league as well. So yeah, they're another great defense. They're insane. I think really they did kind of get screwed over a little bit because of injuries and the fact that the Steelers kind of had a weird schedule with COVID and how games were getting canceled and postponed, and they ended up having their bye week in week 4, and their schedule just getting all mixed up and everything, and it wasn't easy for them, and I guess it also really didn't help that Ben started turning the ball over a lot more and putting the Steelers defense back out on the field and giving opposing offenses short fields because they really couldn't do anything to stop them. But you know what, I expect the Steelers defense to be productive. I do. So expect them to have a good 2021 season. Again, and I'll just throw in another defense here. The Ravens, another defense. They had another good season in 2020. They had 23 total turnovers, 39 sacks. They brought in Calais Campbell, which helps the defensive line, which did help the defensive line. They're going to be playing in the division with the Browns and the Steelers and the Bengals. They're definitely going to get a lot of points against the Bengals because the Bengals are really bad. Not because of Joe Burrow, but because of the guys that are surrounding Joe Burrow, like the offensive line, like I talked about before. But yeah, the Ravens are another defense that you're definitely going to want to draft for your fantasy leagues. So yeah, that's those are the Ravens were kind of the honorable mention, even though they should be on the list. Again, it really wasn't going in any particular order with that, but yeah, those are the defenses that you're definitely going to want to get for your fantasy teams. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do another edition of Draft or Pass, but this time we'll be doing the wide receiver edition of that. So I'll be taking 10 wide receivers and making a decision on whether I would draft them or would I pass on them. So yeah, stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For the final segment of the show, we're going to do another edition of Draft or Pass, and this will be the wide receiver edition. So let's get right into it. So the first wide receiver that I have here today is Courtland Sutton. The wide receiver for the Denver Broncos was a second-round pick back in the 2018 NFL Draft. He only played in one game this past season in 2020. 66 receiving yards, only had 6 points in the game. Only had three receptions on 6 targets, and that only game was against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and then he tore his ACL. So draft or pass. Now let's look at his numbers back in 2019. He played in all 16 games, started 14 of them, had 1,100 yards receiving, averaged 15 yards per reception, 8.9 yards per target, had 150 points in fantasy in terms of standard numbers. And, he had a really good season in 2019, and he had a decent season in 2018, his rookie season, 704 yards, 4 touchdowns, had 94 points there. But again, he was a rookie, trying to get himself involved in the offense. So would I draft or pass him? Coming off an ACL injury, it's tough. But you know what? I think that he's going to be one of those main weapons that Drew Lock has. And the Broncos offense, when you look at it as a whole, is pretty good, in terms of their skill position players. I would draft Courtland Sutton. He's a guy that you could probably get, late in drafts because, again, he's coming off of an injury and there's a lot of guys that you could take before him. But I think he's going to be productive, and he's a big guy that you could throw the ball to in the end zone. I think he should, another guy that, should have a bounce-back season. I definitely would draft him. He could definitely be a number 2 wide receiver, or he could be at your flex. So Courtland Sutton kicks off this edition of Draft or Pass. So with that, let's go to another wide receiver who is going to be suspended at the beginning of the season and recently signed a contract with Miami Dolphins, and that is Will Fuller, who is going to be entering his 6th season in the NFL, was a first-round pick in the 2016 NFL Draft. He was wide receiver 32 in 2020, and he did have a productive season, 8 touchdowns. That was a career high, 879 receiving yards, 135 fantasy points. That's the most in his career in terms of fantasy. Only in 11 games, and that's because of the suspension. So, I think, being with Miami, the one thing is Tua. How is Tua going to do, in year 2 of being the quarterback for the Dolphins? That's the one concern I may have, but I think Will Fuller opposite of Devontae Parker, they have the potential to be a really good wide receiver duo. So I would definitely draft Will Fuller. I think he could be a guy that, again, like Courtland Sutton, you could probably get in the later rounds just because he's suspended. But when he comes back, he definitely has a lot of upside. And the one concern that I have is injuries because, he has been injured a lot over the course of his career, and that is something that, like I've been saying on pretty much every show that I've done, injuries are a concern, and, you're definitely going to want to take that into consideration. But, when Will Fuller comes back, he has the potential to be a productive player for you if you draft him. All right, so the next receiver I have on this list actually had a really productive season with him, his first season with them, and that is the wide receiver for the Bengals, T. Higgins. Will be entering his 2nd season in the NFL. Was a 2nd-round pick in the 2020 draft by the Bengals. Was wide receiver 28, had 6 touchdowns on the year, had 908 receiving yards, and he was productive in fantasy in terms of standard numbers, of course. 127 fantasy points. Obviously, it kind of hurt that Joe Burrow got hurt during the season, which hurt his production a little bit. But he was really productive. Like in terms of where he stands among receivers, he was productive. He's definitely he was a productive bench player. Somebody you could bring in and use him as like a flex option. But he did have some good. He did put up some good numbers. Had 125 yards against the Colts week 6. Had 115 against the Steelers. Back in week 10, he had 15 points there. I think he had a touchdown in that game. Yes, he did have a touchdown in that game. Had 15 points in week 16 against the Texans. Had 99 yards there with a touchdown. So, he did have some productive games. Obviously, the one thing that's concerning is going into this draft, is, the status of Joe Burrow. Because I think if Joe Burrow plays, I think, he's a guy that you're, no questions asked, draft him, I would lean towards the draft side because I think he could be a productive bench player. He can even be a flex option. If he takes that next step, maybe he could be that number 2 wide receiver on your team. So I would draft T. Higgins. I think he does have a lot of upside, and dude is only 22 years old too. So he's got if he continues to play like he did in 2020, he's got a nice career ahead of him. And as long as Joe Burrow's throwing him the football, he's going to have a good season. I mean, Joe Burrow, and him, they clearly had some kind of chemistry going before Joe Burrow got hurt. And you hope that when Joe Burrow comes back, they can reconnect and continue to be productive. The next receiver on this list, I have the wide receiver of the New England Patriots, who was signed by the New England Patriots in the offseason. That is Nelson Aguilar, was a first-round pick back in the 2015 NFL Draft by the Philadelphia Eagles. He spent 2020 with the Raiders, will be entering his 7th season in the NFL, was wide receiver 34, had 8 touchdowns on the season, had just under 900 yards receiving with 896. I talked about him in a segment from, I think it was last show or 2 shows ago, whatever it was. So this is kind of the second time he's making an appearance here on the show. He had his best season, had 137 receiving yards, 137 fantasy points in terms of standard numbers. He did have 8 touchdowns, which tied his career high with 8 from 2017. But this was clearly his best season. He played in all 16 games. Some of his notable good games, one came against the Dolphins in Week 16. Week 7 against the Bucs, he had a good game with 16. He had 12.7 against the Chiefs in Week 5. So he did have a couple good games. Not anything like, numbers like Devontae Adams or, some of these other guys, Stephon Diggs, like some of the other guys, like their numbers that they put up. But you know what? He's a productive flex option. I don't want to say he's a number 2 wide receiver, but yeah, he's a guy that be good for your bench. Now, would I draft or pass on him? Well, now he's with the Patriots. Cam Newton, didn't have a good season with the Panthers in terms of the passing game. He was very effective on the ground, but yeah, he was really bad in the passing game. Do I draft or pass on Aguilar? Now, Nelson Aguilar, I think, is clearly going to be the number 1 wide receiver on this team. It's tough. For me, personally, I probably would pass on Nelson Aguilar just because I think that, Cam Newton really wasn't effective in the passing game. The Patriots do have a lot of weapons now, but I think that Nelson Aguilar is somebody that, can be inconsistent, does have, 1 or 2 games where he just goes off and you're like, where did that come from? But I think he's somebody that, if, you're desperate for wide receiver depth, he could definitely be a guy that's on the waiver wire that you can get. So for me, I'd probably pass on him, but I think that, if he's productive, if Cam Newton is productive, and Nelson Aguilar, doesn't drop the ball and is effective, in terms of like deeper leagues too, if you're playing in like a 16-person league, I think Nelson Aguilar will definitely get drafted. I only play in a 10-person league, so odds he has a greater chance of not getting drafted. But for me, I'd probably pass on him just because there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the quarterback position in New England. All right, so the next receiver I have on this list is Mike Williams, who is the wide receiver for the Chargers. Will be entering his 5th season in the NFL. Was a first-round draft pick back in 2017. Was the 7th overall pick out of Clemson. Was wide receiver 47 in 2020. Had 5 touchdowns on the year. Had 756 receiving yards. Another guy, he's very inconsistent. He has shown flashes. Some of the games that, really had one amazing game, and that was Week 5 against the Saints where he had 22 points, and he had that great catch that I think set up, I don't know, I think it was in overtime, but I don't think the Chargers scored, or it was to set up the game-tying field goal or the go-ahead field. I don't remember what it was. But yeah, he has the potential to put up great numbers, and he just never seems to put it all together for some reason. But yeah, he's definitely a wide receiver that, in this offense, can be productive, and I think Justin Herbert, like I talked about on the last show, Justin Herbert's gonna have a really good year in year 2, and I think that as long as Mike Williams and Keenan Allen and Eckler and whoever else they have on the offense, stay healthy, this offense is going to be really good, and Mike Williams is going to be, one of the guys that, is going to be a main part of that if he also stays healthy, because he has been injured a lot, the past couple seasons since being in the NFL. So now, would I draft or pass on him? I think he's another guy that I'd probably pass on, just because, he's very inconsistent and he gets injured, a decent amount, doesn't play, hasn't really, I don't think he's played a full season since he's been in the NFL. I'm looking at it right now. Actually, he hasn't started every game that he played in the NFL. Actually did play in all 15 games that he played in 2019. Did play in 16 games in 2018. But yeah, I mean, he does get injured. Well, I think it was really just 2017. That's when he got injured. That's why I'm, saying that he's always injured. But 2020 he was injured. But yeah, I mean, he was productive in 2019. Had over 1,000 yards. Well, just had about 1,000 yards. Only had 2 touchdowns though. 2018 he had 10 touchdowns. Had 137 fantasy points there in terms of fantasy, in terms of standard leagues. But yeah, he's another guy I probably would pass on just because he's inconsistent, and you do have to consider the health concern as well. He did miss a couple games in 2020, but yeah, he played in every game in 2019 and 2018. So I think he is a guy you might want to pass on. In terms of deeper leagues, yeah, draft him. If let's say he's sitting there and I need a guy to fill a bench spot, I might take him, just because he's definitely a guy that's going to be there at the end of most drafts. So he could be taken into consideration, but for the most part, probably would pass on him just because of the inconsistencies. All right, so the next receiver I have Jalen Reagor, who will be entering his second season, was the 21st overall pick in the 2020 NFL Draft by the Philadelphia Eagles. They didn't take Justin Jefferson. They decided to take this guy. And he was wide receiver 89 and only had 1 touchdown. He played in 11 games. He started in 10, had 54 targets, only caught 31 of them. Had 396 yards, 1 touchdown, like I said. Did average 12.8 yards per reception. I think this was his longest reception was 55 yards. I think that's what this means on here. Only had 50 points. I guess the best game that he had was against Dallas in Week 80 at 10.2 fantasy points, but that's because when he had a touchdown. So, he was expected to do big things for the Eagles his rookie season, and he really didn't do that. Now, would I draft or pass on him? Another guy I'd probably pass on just because, just basing it off of his rookie season, and also because the Eagles I don't know what they're gonna do. I just don't know what this team's gonna look like in 2021, but it's not gonna look very good. I mean, Jalen Reagor might be the primary option for Jalen Hurts, because, they did get rid of Deshaun Jackson and Alshon Jeffrey. So maybe Jalen Reagor can be productive in that regard. I think the only reason why I would pass on him is really just because of the uncertainty. And you know what? We've seen guys, they have terrible first seasons and they come out and they play amazing in their second seasons in the NFL. So I'm just saying I would pass on him just because I don't know how he's going to be. I don't know. If he's good and he's productive, he's a guy that, get him off the waiver wire. But for now, I'd probably just pass on him just because of the uncertainty that he brings to the table. All right, so the next player on this list, I have Juju Smith-Schuster, who will be entering his 5th season in the NFL. He was a second-round draft pick back in the 2017 NFL Draft by the Pittsburgh Steelers. Was very productive his rookie season. Had 917 yards receiving, had 7 touchdowns. Was very productive there, and was productive in 2018, being opposite of Antonio Brown. Had 1,400 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns there. Had 185 fantasy points, which that's, again, in terms of standard leagues. Yeah, so he was productive there. And listen, in 2020, he had 9 touchdowns, had 137 fantasy points, which is second behind how many points he had in 2018. So the numbers, like when you're just looking at them, those are okay numbers. But you know what? I would pass on him just because he just really hasn't. He never really, took that next step to be that number one wide receiver. He's not. I think it's safe to say he's not that number one wide receiver. He's a productive wide receiver in the right situation. I think he's definitely a great number two, but he's not a number one. And now, yes, he surprisingly is making his return to Pittsburgh. He signed that 1-year contract to return to Pittsburgh to stay with the Steelers. So that was, at least, he showed some loyalty. But the antics, with all the TikTok stuff and the Corvette, dance or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it was ridiculous. I mean, that was, it was ridiculous, bottom line. But you know what? That has nothing to do with fantasy. But, yeah, I'd probably pass on him just because you just can't trust him. Now, he could be a nice flex option possibly, and somebody maybe you can get off the waiver wire. But for me, I'm passing on him. I've passed on him a lot. I think the only time I really wanted to draft him was when he was going to be the number one wide receiver when Antonio Brown left. But yeah, I think we know what Juju is, and he's not a number one. Also, I just don't know what the Steelers' offense is going to look like. They got to address the running back position. They gotta fix that offensive line because guys retired and left in free agency. So the Steelers' offense is going to look very different in terms of the offensive line, and we got to see what they do at running back because they didn't address it in free agency. So they're probably going to look towards the draft to get somebody. But yeah, in terms of Juju, I'd probably pass on him. So yeah, Juju Smith-Schuster, the next player on this list. So next player on this list, we actually have a former Pittsburgh Steeler, and that is Emmanuel Sanders, who recently signed a contract with the Buffalo Bills. He is entering his 12th season in the NFL, was a third-round pick back in the 2010 NFL Draft by the Steelers. Has had a very productive career. You look at his statistics over the course of his career. I mean, in terms of fantasy, his best numbers came when he was with the Broncos, especially in 2014 when he had 200 points there. Was productive for, the 49ers and the Saints, in terms of his, where he falls in terms of his fantasy status. And he played in 14 games, had 103 points in 2020 with the Saints, had 726 yards, 5 touchdowns, averaged 11.9 yards per reception. He was productive. Now, I would draft him to be a bench player, to be a flex guy, but that's really about it. I mean, he's a guy you're probably going to get in later rounds. I think he'll have a better season with the Bills than he did with the Saints, just because I think with Stephon Diggs being opposite of him, and you got Cole Beasley in the slot, everybody's going to have their attention on Diggs, so, they're going to go to Sanders and Beasley, and I think because of that, Emmanuel Sanders is going to benefit from that, and Josh Allen loves to throw the football around, so that also helps. So, yeah, I would draft Emmanuel Sanders, and like I said, he's a guy who can get in the later rounds. So the next guy I have on this list, the final two guys I have on this list are New York Giants. First one is Darius Slayton. He was a 5th-round pick in the 2019 NFL Draft by the Giants. Will be entering his 3rd season in the NFL. Is a wide receiver. Was wide receiver 53 in 2020. And, yeah, it did kind of take a step back in 2020. Had only 91 fantasy points. In 2019, he had 122. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Giants really, didn't have a true number one wide receiver, and Slayton was kind of looked at as that guy that could be that. And, it looked very encouraging after week 1. He had 22 fantasy points after week 1. He had 2 touchdowns, 102 yards against the Steelers. So it looked like he was going to have a breakout season, but then he failed to reach anywhere near that number and only reached double digits one other time after that amazing week 1 performance against the Steelers. He only had 12.9 points against the Cowboys in week 5. Other than that, really didn't do anything. And yeah, he only had Only had 3 touchdowns on the season. So, yeah, it was pretty disappointing after that strong start that he had. So, would I draft or pass on him? I would definitely draft him. He could definitely be a flex option. Just because I think now with the additions of Galladay and, you add Kyle Rudolph, you still have Sterling Shepard. They're going to have a lot of weapons there. Saquon's coming back. So defense is going to be focused on a lot of other players on that offense. So I think that's going to open up the door for more opportunities for Slayton. The one concern is the QB position, because let's see if Daniel Jones really is what he says he's going to be. Well, not really what he says he's going to be, but what people say he's going to be. He's kind of the guy that is a deciding factor here. I would draft Darius Slayton. I think that now with the additions of more weapons and Saquon coming back, I think you would. I think you draft him. You could definitely get him in the later rounds. And then finally, I have Sterling Shepard. I would probably draft him, to be a flex guy, because he does get targets. There is a nice connection between him and Daniel Jones. He only had 96 fantasy points, and he's definitely somebody that he's not always going to put up big numbers, but you know what? I think in terms of him just being what he is and being a bench or flex player, he could definitely provide that. And he has a good connection with Daniel Jones. So, yeah. I would probably draft Sterling Shepard, but again, get him in the later rounds because, he's really right now just a flex or, a bench player. So, yeah, with that, those are the wide receivers for this edition of Draft or Pass. So that is all the time we have for today. I thank you for joining us. Make sure to subscribe to our social media platforms and write a nice review. We greatly appreciate it. And yeah, that is all the time we got. So I'm Kenneth Gruenfelder signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Have a good day, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.